Imagine a forest so dark in Gaul that even the moon refuses to enter. The year is 50 BC. A cold wind cuts through the pines like a knife sharpened on bone. Inside a circle of leather tents, the Roman camp breathes a foul, heavy air. The stench is unbearable: spoiled tallow, dried sweat, and something worse than fear: suspicion. 12 men are stretched out side by side over the hardened earth. Their backs scream from carrying 40 kilos of equipment across rocky terrain. Their feet are open wounds inside the caligae. And yet, none of them sleep. They do not stare at the horizon waiting for barbarians. They stare at the man breathing next to them. Because in the deadliest army the world had ever seen, dozing off at the wrong second meant being buried before sunrise. And the killers would not come from the forest. They would rise from the same blanket that warmed your body. History books sold you a lie. They tell you Rome conquered everything from Britain to the Sahara because of polished gladius blades and elegant battle formations. That is the comfortable version, the version they teach in school. The real story is darker, and it was hidden on purpose. Rome did not dominate the ancient world with steel. Rome dominated through a science of psychological terror. The generals understood something that no civilization had dared to weaponize before. A soldier who fears his own officer will never run from an enemy. Every detail of camp life was engineered to break the human spirit and rebuild it into a machine that obeyed without thinking. The tent was not shelter. The tent was a slaughterhouse for the soul, where each man's name, family, and free will were ground into dust and replaced by one thing only: absolute animal obedience. Tonight, we crawl under the cowhide of those tents. We are going to dissect, hour by hour, what really happened during a Roman night on campaign. You will feel the exhaustion that broke grown men. You will taste the claustrophobia of 8 bodies pressed against you in the dark. And you will discover the bloodiest ritual ever invented by a uniformed army. A ceremony so cruel, it forced soldiers to club their best friend to death with their own hands, while crying. By the end of this video, you will understand the uncomfortable truth. The empire that ruled the world was not built on courage. It was built on men too terrified to close their eyes. Before we step past the centuries and into the darkness, drop in the comments the city and country you are watching from right now. And take 1 second to hit subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. Listen to the sound of iron eating the world. It starts before the first bird sings. 30,000 human bodies stepping at the exact same instant against a road of crushed gravel. The noise is not a clean echo. It is a deep, grinding pulse, a metallic groan that travels through the stones, climbs up the shin, and locks itself inside the kneecap. The Roman boot, called the caligae, was not footwear. It was an instrument of war disguised as a sandal. Its sole carried 3 thick layers of cured ox leather, stacked and stitched, with sharp iron nails driven straight through from below. On muddy ground, those nails bit into the earth like claws. On the polished stones of a Roman road, the same nails turned the boot into a blade on ice. Men slipped at random. Ankles snapped sideways under the impossible weight. But the column never paused. You corrected your balance in less than a heartbeat, or you went down, and the man marching behind you stepped directly onto your spine without slowing his pace. A modern soldier today carries about 30 kilos of equipment into combat, distributed across reinforced backpacks, built with foam padding and ergonomic straps designed by engineers. The Roman legionary carried the exact same weight, but he carried it hanging from a wooden stick. A pole shaped like a Y, called the furka. He balanced this rough wood over his right shoulder like a peasant carrying water. Dangling from the tip of the furka was the sarsina, a leather sack that contained every piece of his existence. Inside the bag, a bronze pot for cooking, a hand saw, a heavy iron pickaxe, a wicker basket for carrying earth, a curved sickle to cut wheat, and 3 days of raw, unground grain. With every step, the wooden pole sawed deeper into the trapezius muscle of the shoulder. To shift the weight even slightly, you had to break the rhythm of your march. And breaking the rhythm meant attracting the eyes of the optio. The optio was the officer who marched at the back of every century. His job was not to motivate the men, nor to inspire them with speeches about glory. His job was to preserve the mathematical perfection of the column. He carried a thick stick, often cut from the dense, knotted root of a grapevine. If a soldier slowed down, if a man tried to reach under the leather strap to ease the burning on his raw, bleeding shoulder, the optio said nothing. He simply lifted the wood and brought it down. The stick cracked against the curve of the helmet or directly into the ribs. It was a brutal, silent reminder of the supreme Roman doctrine. Your suffering does not exist. Your body is not yours. It is property of the state, and the state demands 20 Roman miles per day. No excuses, no mercy. The march was a slow demolition of the human body. The armor, called lorica hamata, was a shirt made of 15 kilos of small iron rings linked together, one by hand. It was worn on top of a padded wool tunic, but within the first hour, the sweat and constant friction had already destroyed the protective layer. The iron rings began to chew directly into the skin of the collarbones and shoulders. By the 5th hour of the march, the salt from the soldiers' own sweat ran down their faces and dripped into their eyes, burning the surface of the cornea like a slow, invisible acid. They marched in absolute silence, talking wasted oxygen, and disrupted the cadence of the footsteps. The only sounds permitted by the world were the clinking of metal on metal, the rhythmic crunching of nailed boots on stone, and the heavy, ragged breathing of thousands of men, silently counting how many more steps their cartilage could survive. They drank a liquid called posca, a strange brew of fermented sour wine mixed with water. It tasted vile, but the acidity was strong enough to kill the bacteria from whatever filthy stream they had filled their canteens at that morning. They ate bucellatum, a kind of military hardtack baked so dry and so hard that biting it directly could break a molar in half. They had to soak it in liquid before chewing, and they ate while walking. There were no organized breaks under shady trees, no pauses to sit and stretch the legs. If a man's knee finally collapsed under the weight, the column simply opened around him like water flowing around a rock in a river. No medical rescue, no comrades stopping to help. If you could not stand back up on your own, your tent mates were forced to divide your 40 kilos of gear among themselves. They left you behind on the side of the road, alive but broken, abandoned to the camp followers, to thieves, or to the wolves that always tracked the legions from the forests. This was not cruelty by accident. It was cruelty by engineering. It created a terrifying form of peer pressure. You did not march because of loyalty to some emperor sitting on a marble throne hundreds of miles away in Rome. You marched because if you fell, the man next to you, your best friend, your brother in arms, would have to carry your bronze pot, and he would hate you forever for it. After 30 kilometers of this slow torture, the sun begins to slide down behind the trees. The muscles are completely poisoned with lactic acid. The discs in the spine feel compressed, to the point of grinding bone against bone. Any normal army on Earth, upon arriving at its destination, would collapse in a heap. The men would throw their packs to the ground, rip off their boots, and lie face down in the grass like dying animals. The Roman legionary did the opposite. He stopped in perfect formation. He stood at attention, helmet still on, staring forward at an empty, wild field full of weeds and stones. There was no rest. There was no relief. Because for the Romans, the march was not the end of the day. The march was only the warm-up. The advance party had arrived 2 hours earlier. A specialized unit of engineers and mathematicians, the agrimensors, had already begun their work in silence. These men did not look at a forest and see nature. They saw a chaotic equation that needed to be solved and erased. They worked with an instrument called the groma, a vertical wooden staff topped with a horizontal cross, from which hung 4 lead plumb lines. The surveyor planted the groma into the ground and sighted along the strings with cold, mechanical precision. With nothing but geometry, he traced perfectly straight lines across the uneven, hostile terrain. The earth was forced to obey mathematics. A white flag was driven into the exact mathematical center of the chosen field. This single point marked the praetorium, the tent of the commander. From that one origin, a gigantic invisible grid was projected outward in every direction across the wild land. Colored pennants stabbed into the earth marked the future streets of the camp. Red flags indicated the avenues for the tribunes. Blue flags indicated the blocks where the infantry would sleep. The chaotic wilderness was mathematically subdued and conquered before a single Roman sword was ever drawn from its sheath. Surrounding this enormous geometric grid, there was a wide empty zone called the intervallum, a perfect ring of cleared earth exactly 60 meters wide, separating the outer defensive wall from the first row of tents. Most military historians describe this gap as a simple tactical buffer, designed to keep sleeping soldiers safe from incoming flaming arrows or thrown javelins. That explanation is technically correct, but it hides something much darker. The intervallum had a deeper psychological function. It was an open theater. The Romans had understood, long before modern psychologists, that secrecy is the seed of mutiny. The intervallum eliminated every shadow. There were no bushes to crouch behind, no blind angles behind the tents, no hidden corners where 3 or 4 men could whisper without being seen. The camp was an architectural panopticon, an invention 2,000 years ahead of its time. The straight lines of the Via Principalis, the main street, allowed a centurion standing in the middle of the camp to see for hundreds of meters in any direction without anything blocking his line of sight. If a man stepped even slightly out of his assigned zone, his silhouette immediately broke the perfect geometry of the grid. To be out of place was, by itself, a crime. To be out of place was to deserve punishment. The grid was a cage built from empty space. It removed the unpredictability of nature and replaced it with constant, merciless surveillance. You were watched at every second. You were known at every moment. You did not exist outside of the grid. A bronze horn cuts through the air. The men break formation, but they do not rest. They lower their heavy rectangular shields, the scuta, planting them carefully into the dirt. They untie the wooden poles from their shoulders. They open the leather sacks and pull out the delabra, the iron pickaxe. They walk to the outer perimeter marked by the surveyors, and they begin to dig. This is the great deception of the Roman camp, the lie that historians have repeated for 2,000 years. The traditional version says the men dug the ditch to protect themselves from barbarian attacks. The trench kept them safe at night, but safety was only an accidental side effect. The real purpose of digging the trench was something far more sinister. The trench existed to break the soldier from the inside. The mechanics of the work were designed with surgical precision to push the human body past the threshold of structural collapse. The ditch, called the fossa, had to be exactly 1 meter deep and 1 meter wide. Not approximately. Exactly. The men swung their heavy iron picks into hard clay, into frozen winter mud, into solid bedrock. Each time the iron struck stone, the impact sent a shock wave traveling up the wooden handle directly into the small bones of the wrist, then up the forearm, then exploding into the elbow joint. The blisters that had formed on their hands during the morning march were instantly torn open by the friction against the oak handle. Raw, exposed flesh rubbed against rough wood. Blood mixed with dirt and stuck to the grip. They dug for 2 hours, then 3, then 4. The displaced earth was not simply thrown to the side. Every shovelful was loaded into the same wicker baskets the men had carried on their backs all day. The baskets traveled up a human chain of exhausted bodies to construct the agger, a tall earthen wall built directly behind the trench. The forearms cramped until the fingers locked into claws that could no longer open. The muscles of the lower back seized and burned. They stood inside a hole they were digging for themselves, breathing in dust, swinging the iron pickaxe until their vision began to fade at the edges. Why did the commanders force this ritual every single night, without exception, even when marching through friendly territory in central Italy? Even when no enemy army was within 100 kilometers in any direction? They dug because the work itself was a form of psychological domination. A man who has only marched 30 kilometers still has enough energy left in his body to complain. A man who can complain can also think. A man who can think can rebel. The Roman military machine operated on a brutal principle of total ownership of the human soul. You take their souls before the enemy ever gets the chance to look them in the eye. The commanders forced the men to spit out every last drop of resistance, every fragment of personal will, every ounce of unspent energy directly into the dirt of the ditch. Physical exhaustion was the tool used to dissolve the ego. When your hands are bleeding, your back is locked into a knot, and your lungs are burning, you stop thinking about your family back home. You stop thinking about the centurion you hate. You stop thinking about yourself as a man with a name, a mother, a past, a dream. You become nothing more than a muscle attached to a piece of wood. Digging stripped men down to the most primitive layer of animal instinct. It was a ritual of submission, performed every afternoon as the sun went down behind the hills. The trench was a monument to their own captivity. They built the walls of their own prison every single day with their own blood to prove to the empire that they belonged to it. When the displaced earth had been piled high enough into the agger, the final act of the perimeter defense began. Each soldier had carried 2 pila muralia on his back throughout the entire march. These were heavy wooden stakes, thick in the middle and sharpened at both ends, specifically carved so that they could be locked together in a deadly interlocking pattern. The men drove these stakes into the top of the fresh earthen rampart and tied them with leather cords. Within minutes, the mound transformed into a wall bristling with spikes, impenetrable to cavalry, deadly to any climber. Only then, when the sun had vanished completely behind the dark line of the forest and the iron fire baskets were lit, throwing long, flickering shadows across the perfect grid, did the centurion finally raise the silver whistle to his lips. The perimeter was sealed. The pickaxes were cleaned of blood and dirt, then carefully stored. History does not live in the marble statues and triumphal arches. History lives in the dirt, where real blood was spilled and forgotten. We refuse to sanitize the past, And to keep digging these dark truths out of the mud, we need an inner circle. We invite you to join the lineage. This is the channel membership, but it is not a donation box, and it is not charity. It is a roster of people who refuse the sterilized school textbook version of the human story. By joining the ranks of the lineage, you keep this channel independent, aggressive, and free of corporate filters. You also gain access to early releases, behind-the-scenes content, and an exclusive badge of the Legion next to your name. Click the Join button below the video. Take your place in the ranks. Help us keep the fires burning. The silver whistle pierces the air across the intervallum. The physical labor of the day is officially over. The men wipe the blood from their palms against the rough wool of their tunics. They turn their backs to the perimeter wall they just built with their own broken hands. They walk down the perfectly straight dirt avenues toward the grid of canvas tents that waits for them in the growing dark. A modern mind would imagine this as the moment of relief. The moment to eat warm food, to lie down on a blanket, to close the eyes and let the body begin to heal. But as the 8 men of the contubernium approach their assigned leather tent, something strange happens to their bodies. Their heart rates do not slow down. They accelerate. The march had bruised their bones. The trench had broken their backs. But all that physical agony was nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the psychological horror that was waiting for them in the darkness ahead. The true nightmare of the Roman legion was never outside the walls of the camp. The true nightmare was inside the tent. The fabric of the Roman night was not really fabric at all. It was skin. Dead skin stretched over wood. The legionary tent had a strange, almost poetic name, papilio, the Latin word for butterfly. The veterans laughed bitterly at the name because it came from the way the front and back flaps unfolded outward in the morning, opening like delicate wings. But there was nothing delicate inside. The papilio was a heavy, suffocating dome built entirely from sewn hides of goats and calves, slaughtered for this exact purpose. One single tent consumed the skins of more than 40 animals. And those hides were not soft, supple leather like a luxury jacket. They were cured inside enormous vats filled with fermented urine. This was the official Roman tanning method used for centuries, because the ammonia in stale urine broke down the hair follicles and chemically preserved the leather forever. The process worked. It also left a sharp, acrid stench permanently soaked into every square centimeter of the material. To make the roof waterproof against the relentless rains of northern Europe, the army quartermasters demanded that the leather be coated in a thick layer of sebum, cheap animal fat, rendered from the hard, fibrous tallow of cattle and sheep. Under the burning Mediterranean sun, this fat turned rancid in just a few days, attracting flies in dark, humming clouds. In the freezing forests of Gaul or Germania, the fat congealed and hardened into a stiff, greasy shell of crust. A dry papilio weighed nearly 40 kilograms by itself before any equipment was added. When the autumn rains of the north arrived and battered the camp for days without pause, the leather drank the water like a sponge. The weight of the tent literally doubled in a few hours. The hides swelled. The hand-stitched seams strained and stretched. The rancid fat trapped the water inside instead of repelling it. This swollen, stinking, dripping creature of leather was the shelter. This was the only refuge the empire offered to the men who carved its borders into the map of the world. The internal geometry of the papilio was a small masterpiece of psychological cruelty disguised as engineering. The floor plan measured exactly 3 meters by 3 meters, but it was not a clean cube. The walls sloped sharply inward from a central ridgepole at the top, meaning that a grown man could only stand fully upright in one tiny spot, right in the dead center. The edges of the floor, where the leather met the dirt, were almost useless. You could not sit there. You could not even kneel comfortably. Into this cramped, leaning, leather-skinned coffin, the Roman war machine inserted 8 fully grown, broken men. This 8-man unit was called the contubernium. They were not just soldiers who fought beside one another. They lived as a single, fused biological organism inside that 3x3 square of cured skin. Do the math of the available floor space carefully. Subtract the sloping, unusable corners. What remains is an area roughly equivalent to the inside of a modern freight elevator. Now imagine cramming 8 grown men into that elevator. But these men do not arrive empty-handed. They must drag all their weapons inside, because leaving iron outside in the damp night would mean rust by morning, and rust meant a flogging. 8 massive rectangular wooden shields, the scuta, leaned against the central pole. 8 long iron-tipped javelins, the pila, were carefully laid along the canvas walls. 8 bronze helmets, 8 cooking pots, 8 complete sets of interlocking iron ringmail armor coiled like dead snakes in the corners. The equipment alone devoured a third of the breathable space. When the men finally collapsed to sleep, stretching the limbs was impossible. There was no room. They had to sleep on their sides, packed together shoulder against shoulder, chest against back, like blocks of stone in the wall of a fortress. If a single man needed to roll over to relieve the pressure on his bruised hip bone, he had to physically coordinate the movement with the man pressed against him. One small shift sent a ripple through the entire tent. An elbow struck a rib. A knee crashed into someone's spine. The chainmail piled in the corner clinked like coins in the dark. Silence was a fantasy. Sleep was an illusion that visited only briefly, then disappeared. The air quality inside the papilio collapsed within minutes of the flaps being tied shut against the wind. 8 pairs of lungs sucking down the limited oxygen, exhaling carbon dioxide back into the same enclosed bubble. Ventilation was practically non-existent by design. The thick, fat-soaked leather captured every emanation released by the human body. These men had marched 30 kilometers through cold mud earlier that day. They had dug ditches until the skin tore from their palms. They had not properly bathed in weeks, sometimes months. The combined stench of unwashed bodies, dried blood, oxidized sweat, infected wounds, and the pungent sulfur of the garlic and raw onions they constantly chewed to fight off disease created a miasma so dense and physical it had a flavor. You did not just smell it. You could taste it at the back of your throat for hours. They ate their evening rations inside this sealed space, a thick, unseasoned, gluey porridge made from crushed emmer wheat, boiled in plain water over a small fire built outside, then carried inside in shared bronze bowls. It was called pulse. It was heavy, fibrous, hard to digest, and it sat in the stomach for hours like wet concrete. The biological reality of 8 men digesting that quantity of rough grain in a completely sealed leather room is something marble statues and triumphant frescoes never show. It was a slow, suffocating, gas-filled nightmare from which there was no escape until dawn. To survive the freezing temperatures of the Gallic winter nights, the men depended entirely on the sagum, the standard wool cloak of the legions. It was woven from coarse, unwashed sheep's wool. Unrefined wool meant it still contained a high natural concentration of lanolin, the greasy, waxy substance secreted by the sheep's own skin. Lanolin is naturally hydrophobic. It repelled rain and trapped body heat very effectively, which is why the legions chose it over softer wool. But lanolin had a horrifying side effect. The greasy warmth of the cloak turned it into a perfect biological incubator, the ideal breeding habitat for Pediculus humanus corporis, the human body louse. Historians love to focus on swords, helmets, and tactics, but the most dangerous predator inside the Roman camp was microscopic. The lice colonized the thick seams of every sagum and every woolen tunic worn underneath the chainmail. They fed on human blood, 24 hours a day. In the absolute black darkness of the tent, the men could not see them, but they could feel them moving. Dozens of bites burning across the shoulders, the groin, the armpits, the back of the neck. The itching was constant and relentless. The sound of 8 men silently scratching their own raw, infected skin echoed inside the leather walls all night long, like rats scraping wood. If a man scratched too aggressively, dirt from under his fingernails entered the open wound. Staphylococcus infections spread like wildfire. There was no medical isolation tent for the lower ranks. If one man in the contubernium carried lice when he joined the unit, within 48 hours all 8 men were infested down to their underclothes. The brutal physical proximity engineered into the papilio was not an accident of poor military planning. It was a deliberate surgical psychological weapon designed by Roman commanders over centuries of refinement. They understood, intuitively and through experience, that a man left alone with his own thoughts will eventually remember his small farm back in Italy. He will remember the face of his wife waiting in the doorway. He will remember the taste of freedom. The commanders eradicated privacy in order to eradicate the individual. You had no personal space. You had no private corner. You had no moment alone with yourself. You heard every breath of the men around you. You heard every grunted curse, every whispered nightmare, every involuntary noise the human body makes during sleep. You smelled their sickness. You felt their shivering against your own ribs. This forced, inescapable intimacy created a trauma bond stronger than any oath of loyalty ever sworn by hand on a sword. You did not love the men sleeping in your tent. Often, you actively hated them. They stole your rations when you turned your back. They kicked you in the kidneys during their nightmares. They coughed bacteria directly into your face for hours, but they were also your only source of heat in the heart of winter. The combined body warmth of the contubernium, packed tightly together, was the only barrier preventing hypothermia from killing all of you before dawn. You depended on the man next to you to radiate that warmth. You depended on him to keep his armor clean of rust. You depended on him to swing his pickaxe in the trench tomorrow afternoon so you would not be forced to dig his portion on top of your own. The commanders systematically stripped away every grand illusion of patriotism and noble purpose. The empire was an abstract idea on a map. The emperor was a small, distant face stamped onto a silver coin. But the man sleeping with his face pressed against yours was flesh, blood, breath, and bone. You fought to keep him alive, because if he died, the brutal arithmetic of your own survival immediately collapsed. A tent of 7 men is colder than a tent of 8. A gap in the shield wall on the battlefield tomorrow means a Gallic longsword finds your throat. The Roman military intelligently weaponized the primal human terror of freezing and dying alone in the dark. They transformed 8 strangers from different provinces into a permanent hostage situation. Your individual identity was erased completely, dissolved, replaced by a number on a roll call list. Disease was a constant invisible predator that stalked the contubernium from dusk until dawn. Dysentery, which the veteran legionaries called the bloody flux, tore through entire camps with devastating speed. The primary infection vector was contaminated drinking water from poorly chosen streams. But the secondary vector was the tent itself. When a man contracted dysentery, his bowels turned to liquid within hours. The cramping was so violent it dropped grown men to their knees. In the freezing middle of the night, he had to untie the heavy leather flaps, crawl into the freezing wind, and stumble toward the open latrine trenches dug at the perimeter of the camp. Sometimes he did not make it in time. The soiled woolen tunics could not be properly washed in the field. They were simply scraped clean with a knife and worn again the next morning. The bacteria traveled to the hands, then to the wooden handles of the shields, then to the shared bronze bowls that delivered the morning pulls into every mouth. Listen to the chorus of coughs echoing down the Via Principalis at 3 in the morning. Respiratory infections multiplied violently in the damp, freezing air trapped inside the tents. Pneumonia filled the lungs with fluid, drowning men from the inside while they were still breathing. A soldier with a high fever would shiver uncontrollably, his teeth clicking together like dice in a wooden cup, stealing warmth from every man pressed against his sides. There was no sympathy waiting for him. Pity is a luxury that only comfortable societies can afford. Inside the Roman camp, a sick man was simply a liability. He slowed the march tomorrow. He compromised the daily labor quota. The men in the tent would force him to stand up. They would force him to eat. They would push him forward into the column with ruthless, almost cruel peer pressure. Because if he collapsed out of the ranks, the Optio would turn his oak staff against the other 7 men. The psychological toll of this existence is almost impossible for a modern mind to truly grasp. We are accustomed to retreating into silence and solitude to heal our minds after a hard day. The Roman legionary never experienced silence. Not a single moment of it. The camp was a living hive of more than 30,000 human beings packed into a small geometric space. Even at the very deepest point of midnight, the ambient noise never dropped below a low, constant, grinding roar. The clatter of sentries rotating shifts on the perimeter, the stamping of the cavalry horses against the frozen mud, the crackle of the iron fire baskets burning all night, the moans of the wounded and the sick. The human brain requires a very specific, uninterrupted sequence of sleep cycles, descending into deep REM in order to repair cognitive function and maintain basic sanity. The Roman tent made true REM sleep biologically impossible. You did not sleep. You hovered in a constant state of hypervigilant half-consciousness. Your subconscious was always listening for the crunch of the centurion's boots on the gravel outside. You were always braced for the sudden blast of the cornu, the curved brass horn that signaled a surprise night raid by barbarians. Chronic, accumulated sleep deprivation breaks the mind long before it breaks the body. Paranoia explodes. Visual hallucinations begin dancing at the edges of peripheral vision. The shadows cast by the flickering fires outside the tent look exactly like men holding knives, crouching to strike. Tempers ignited over the smallest meaningless triggers. A boot kicked out of place. A drop of water spilled from the canteen. A word spoken slightly too loudly inside the tent. Any of these could erupt into a sudden brutal fistfight between exhausted men inside the cramped leather walls. But the violence was always contained, controlled, swallowed back down. It had to be. Because if the contubernium attracted the attention of the officers, the punishment would never be individual. It would be collective. The commanders operated on the iron principle of extreme shared liability. If a single man inside the tent fell asleep during his guard duty, all 8 men would be punished together. If one man lost his sword on the march, all 8 would have their pay confiscated. This forced the soldiers to police one another with brutal efficiency. They became their own wardens, their own judges, their own executioners. The threat of violence from a centurion was bad enough, but the threat of being beaten in the dark by 7 exhausted, furious tent-mates whose rations had just been cut because of your mistake was something much, much worse. The commanders had constructed an entire ecosystem of peer-driven terror. You did not step out of line because the men waiting to punish you were the same men who would hold your life in their hands the next day on the battlefield. You learned to swallow your pain. You learned to ignore the lice burrowing into your skin. You learned to ignore the cold, the hunger, the screaming in your joints. You learned to function as a mechanical, soulless component inside a merciless human machine. Before we descend into the darkest hour of the Roman night and reveal the secret ritual that actually forged this iron discipline, look at the screen for a moment. The main historical source we use to reconstruct these brutal details of camp life is available right now through the View Products button below the video. This book is a monolithic archive of organized military terror. It tears away the polished myth of Roman glory and exposes the gruesome, calculated, almost surgical mechanics of legionary survival. It was the bedrock of our research for this entire story, and you genuinely need to own it if you want to understand the depth of what we are uncovering. While you are there, explore the rest of the shelf. We curated a small collection of obscure, themed relics and dark memorabilia hidden right beside the book. Open the shop, browse the artifacts waiting there, and step one level deeper into the dark with us. Inside the tent, a man slowly opens his eyes in the absolute blackness. He has been asleep for barely 2 hours. A heavy, calloused hand shakes his shoulder roughly. It is time. The second watch is finished. The Tertia Vigilia, the third watch, is beginning right now. This is the most lethal shift of the entire night. From midnight until 3 in the morning, the temperature outside is at its absolute coldest point. The human body's natural circadian rhythm is screaming inside his skull, begging for unconsciousness. The man crawls out from beneath his wool cloak. His joints crack and pop. His fingers are already numb. He reaches for his iron-tipped spear and his heavy shield. He pushes open the leather flaps and steps out of the papilio into the freezing, slicing wind. He is about to walk to the outer perimeter and stand in the dark, staring into the black wall of the forest. He knows the barbarians might be out there somewhere, watching the firelight from the trees. But he also knows, with a much colder fear, exactly what waits for him back inside the camp if he allows his eyes to close for even a single heartbeat. The water clock is dripping. The countdown has begun. The outer perimeter wall was a strange kind of border. It was a line between two completely different ways of dying. On one side of the packed earth and the rows of sharpened wooden stakes stretched the endless, lightless, freezing wilderness of the Gallic forest. On the other side, behind that same wall, hummed the merciless internal machinery of Rome itself. The men assigned to guard duty did not face the camp behind them. They turned their backs on the firelight and faced the trees. They stood positioned 3 meters apart along the agger, the high earthen rampart. They gripped the long oak shafts of their spears with numb fingers. They waited in silence. Time inside the Roman camp was not measured by the slow rotation of constellations across the sky. The legions did not trust the stars. Time was measured by water. Inside the praetorium, the central tent of the legate, sat the clepsydra, the water clock. The device was simple, a large bronze basin filled completely with water. At the bottom of the basin, a tiny hole, drilled with mathematical precision by a craftsman in Rome, allowed the water to drip slowly into a second basin positioned below it. Floating on the surface of the lower basin sat a small cork attached to a thin vertical rod. As the water level steadily climbed, the rod rose along a wooden scale carved with numbered marks. The dripping was perfectly silent, but each individual drop determined the fate of every sentry standing on the wall. The night was divided into 4 equal segments, the vigiliae. The first watch and the second watch were miserable, but the body still held a reserve of warmth left over from the daylight hours. The fourth watch came with the psychological reward of the approaching dawn. But the third watch, the tertia vigilia, was the true test. It stretched from midnight into the coldest, blackest hours just before sunrise. Biology itself transforms into an enemy during the third watch. The human circadian rhythm hits its absolute lowest point. The core temperature of the body drops by nearly 2 degrees Celsius. The brain, already saturated with adenosine after days of brutal physical exhaustion and chronic sleep deprivation, begins to shut down small regions of the cerebral cortex one at a time. A man standing perfectly motionless in the freezing wind starts experiencing micro-sleeps without realizing it. His eyes remain open and pointed forward, but his brain stops processing the visual information arriving through them. He becomes functionally blind for 3 to 5 seconds at a stretch. The muscles in his neck quietly relax. His chin tilts downward toward his chest. The Roman commanders knew this phenomenon intimately. They did not care. Human fatigue was not considered a valid defense in any military court. Fatigue was a weakness, and weakness was a virus to be eliminated. To force the sentries to stay awake against the laws of human physiology, the army deployed a brilliant mechanical password system. At the beginning of every night, the tribune of the watch personally inscribed a secret password onto a small flat block of wood called the tessera. This block was placed into the hand of a designated soldier inside the 10th maniple. That soldier walked through the dark to the 9th maniple and handed it to the sentry posted there. From there, the tessera traveled hand to hand down the entire line of guards, manipule by manipule, until it reached the first. Then, the same block had to be returned all the way back up the chain of command before the sun rose. This wandering piece of wood functioned as a mechanical pulse, constantly checking the heartbeat of the entire camp. If at any point the tessera stopped moving, the message was clear and unambiguous. A link in the human chain had broken. A man had fallen asleep on his post. The enforcement of this entire system fell on the shoulders of the tesserarius, the officer of the watch. He did not patrol the wall carrying a torch. A torch would have destroyed his night vision and would have announced his approach to every sentry from half a kilometer away. The tesserarius moved through the intervallum in absolute silence. He wore dark wool draped over his armor to muffle the soft clinking sound of the iron rings. He carried no shield. He was not a sentinel. He was a hunter, and his prey was his own men. Imagine you are the soldier standing on that rampart at 2 in the morning. Your fingers have lost all sensation around the oak shaft of your spear. The wind tears the last bit of heat from your face. You stare into the black wall of the tree line until the shadows start to twist and bend in ways that no shadow should. Auditory hallucinations begin creeping in. The rustle of dry leaves sounds exactly like the careful step of a barbarian boot. You concentrate so hard on the forest in front of you that you completely forget about the silent space behind you. You let the heavy rim of your shield rest against your knee, just to take the weight off your shoulder for half a second. Your eyelids begin to slip downward. The tesserarius finds you in that exact moment. He does not wake you. He does not yell or curse. He simply reaches out his hand in the dark and silently lifts your shield away from your knee. Or he slips his fingers into your pouch and extracts the tessera. He gathers the physical evidence of your failure, turns around without making a sound, and disappears back into the darkness. When you jerk awake a few seconds later, your weapon is gone. The password block is gone. The cold panic that floods your bloodstream is far colder than the wind on your face. You know exactly what will happen when the sun rises. At dawn, the buccina, the curved brass trumpet of the legion, sounds the morning assembly. 30,000 men form perfect ranks along the dirt avenues. The air is still freezing cold, but no one is permitted to shiver. The silence over the camp is absolute. The legate stands on a raised wooden platform constructed overnight by the camp slaves. The tesserarius steps forward from the ranks and presents the confiscated shield to the officer. He raises his arm and points directly into the formation. The soldier who slept during his watch is ordered to break ranks and walk into the center of the empty avenue. There is no trial. There is no opportunity for the accused man to explain that he had marched 30 kilometers across rocky terrain the day before, that he had dug a perimeter trench for 4 straight hours, that he had been given a damp, stinking tent in which to sleep, and that he had only closed his eyes for a single instant. The Roman state does not function on empathy. The Roman state functions on systems, and the system declares with mathematical certainty that a sleeping sentry compromises the survival of the entire legion. He has committed treason against the lives of his 30,000 brothers. The tribune descends from the wooden platform. He carries a short, undecorated wooden rod called the fustus. He walks slowly across the dirt toward the condemned man. He stops just in front of him. He raises the rod and taps the soldier softly on the shoulder. This single tap is the trigger. It is the official ceremonial sanction of the fustuarium, the ritual of the clubs. The executioners are now called forward. They are not professional torturers. They are not anonymous masked guards. They are not strangers brought from another century. The men ordered to step out of formation and approach the condemned soldier are the 7 other men of his own contubernium. These are the men who shared his cramped leather tent for months, the men who ate from his bronze cooking pot, the men who pressed their bodies against his back to survive the freezing winter nights, the men who carried his equipment up steep hills when he was sick with fever. The Roman command structure never executed its own soldiers directly. It forced the soldiers to execute their own brothers. The tribune hands each of the 7 men a heavy wooden club. Some of them, the more eager ones, lean down and pick up sharp, jagged stones from the defensive trench. The condemned man is stripped of his armor and left wearing only a thin wool tunic. He is not tied to a post or restrained in any way. He is permitted, even encouraged, to run. The first blow almost always strikes the legs or the lower back. A heavy oak club smashes into the femur. The bone splinters audibly. The man collapses face down into the dirt. He tries to crawl forward, dragging his shattered body toward the open gate of the camp at the far end of the avenue. The 7 men advance behind him. They walk slowly. They surround him on all sides. They raise their clubs above their heads and bring them crashing down on his skull, on his collarbones, on his rib cage, on his spine. The sound of wood shattering human ribs echoes down the Via Principalis like firewood being split. Blood sprays across the blue and red pennants that mark the geometry of the streets. You must truly understand the psychology operating inside the 7 men holding the clubs. They cannot fake their swings. They cannot hold back even slightly out of pity for the man dying at their feet. The optio and the centurion stand only a few meters away, watching every single strike with cold, professional attention. If the officers detect that a tentmate is swinging too softly, if they sense even a fraction of hesitation or mercy in the impact, that man is immediately dragged into the center of the avenue and subjected to the exact same execution. The state forces you to make an impossible choice in less than a second. You either preserve your humanity and die beside your friend, or you completely abandon your identity, transform into a killer, and crush the skull of the man you loved last night in order to save your own life. The Roman military machine was built and expanded by the men who chose the second option. They swung the clubs with the full strength of their shoulders. They obliterated the face of the friend they had laughed with the previous evening until his features were a pulp of meat, unrecognizable to his own mother. They drove the breath from his lungs with heavy stones. They kept striking him long after he had stopped moving, just to prove to the officers that they harbored no trace of rebellious sympathy in their hearts. This is the ultimate expression of distributed institutional violence. The legate sitting in the command tent did not have to personally manage the discipline of 30,000 infantrymen. He had designed a system that outsourced the violence to the absolute lowest level of the hierarchy. He had made the soldiers responsible for one another's perfection. By forcing each unit to violently purge its own weakness from within, the commander cemented the surviving men together through shared trauma and inescapable mutual guilt. If, by some rare miracle of human anatomy, the condemned man somehow survived the rain of clubs and managed to drag his broken body outside the gates of the camp, he was not welcomed back into Roman society. He was permanently exiled, declared dead by law. He was stripped of his citizenship, his accumulated pay, and his military honors. The mark of ignominia was burned onto his name forever. His family back in Rome was publicly shamed in their own neighborhood, but survival was almost unheard of. The fustuarium had been engineered as a lethal, theatrical, deliberately gruesome public spectacle. When the execution finished, the brass horns blew once more. The men were ordered back to their assigned duties as if nothing had happened. The body of the dead soldier was dragged across the dirt by camp slaves and thrown into the forest beyond the wall, to be eaten by wolves and stripped clean by ravens. Fresh dirt was kicked over the bloodstains to hide them from the rest of the legion. But the true devastation arrived later that same night. The 7 men of the contubernium walked silently back to their leather tent at dusk. They unpinned the heavy front flaps. They stepped inside. The internal space was exactly the same size it had always been, 3 meters by 3 meters. But now there was a gap. One shield was missing from the central pole. One javelin was no longer lying along the canvas wall. The collective body heat of the contubernium had decreased measurably. They sat in the dark, surrounded by the familiar stench of rancid tallow and wet wool. Their hands were swollen and purple from the impact of the clubs against bone. The dried blood of their tent mate was still spattered across the leather of their boots. They did not speak to one another. They could not even bring themselves to make eye contact. Every man inside that tent now lived with a single, inescapable, permanent truth. The men sitting next to him would kill him without hesitating for a single heartbeat if the tribune ordered it tomorrow morning. There was no trust born from love or brotherhood inside that tent. There was only a sharp, paranoid hypervigilance born from the mutual knowledge of what each of them was now capable of doing. You did not fight bravely in the shield wall the next afternoon because you believed deeply in the glory of Rome. You fought bravely because you were terrified of the men standing to your left and to your right. You had just seen, with your own eyes, exactly what they were capable of doing to you if you broke formation. The commanders understood something profound that modern motivational speakers refuse to admit. Motivation is temporary. Inspirational speeches fade by the end of the same week. Patriotism wavers when the rations run out and the snow begins to fall. But terror is permanent. Terror cannot be forgotten. The Roman army conquered the entire known world because it had successfully engineered an internal environment where the punishment for failure was infinitely more horrifying than anything the enemy could possibly inflict on the battlefield. A Gallic warrior might slash your throat quickly and cleanly with his long iron sword. It would hurt for only a moment. The fustuarium guaranteed that if you failed to perform your duty, your skull would be slowly pulverized to a wet paste by the same men you had trusted with your life and your warmth the night before. The historians of comfortable centuries focus on the polished breastplates, on the soaring stone aqueducts, on the brilliant tactical maneuvers credited to Julius Caesar. They write thick books about the civilized nature of Roman law and the eloquence of Roman senators. But empires are never built on marble floors. Empires are built in the freezing mud. They are constructed by men whose individual identities have been methodically dismantled, ground down to nothing, and replaced with the cold mechanical logic of state survival. The Roman legionary was not a hero in the storybook sense. He was a survivor of a psychological meat grinder. He dug a fresh trench every single night, specifically to break his own spirit. He slept in a suffocating leather coffin to erase his individuality. He stared into the black forest, fighting the involuntary chemical shutdown of his own brain, knowing with absolute certainty that closing his eyes for 1 second was a capital offense. And he carried with him, for the rest of his life, the permanent and unspoken trauma of knowing the exact sound a wooden club makes when it crushes the ribs of a man he had once called brother. This is the true anatomy of the Roman knight. It was a masterpiece of human subjugation. It was a brutal system that transformed simple farmers from rural Italy into apex predators by threatening them with the absolute and total destruction of both their bodies and their social bonds. The empire expanding outward across the map of the ancient world was simply the external projection of the violence those men inflicted on themselves every single night inside their own camp. Thank you for staying with us until the very last second of this video. This channel depends on a community that refuses the sanitized version of history. Make sure you subscribe right now if you have not already. Leave a like on this video to push it into the algorithm, and share it with someone who needs to understand the real, hidden cost of ancient warfare. You have just finished another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate dark history hub on YouTube. Now, look at the video appearing on your screen right now. Click it immediately to continue your descent into the dark with us.